Hello, Noam. It's really good to see you. It must be morning in Arizona. It's evening here in Islamabad. Are you well?
Okay.
Excellent. Noam, there's a whole lot of things that I want to talk to you about, but let me start with this. It appears as if the world is retribalizing. We're going back to our primal tribal loyalties, to religion, to nationalism, and you see this just about everywhere. You see this with Brexit, with the rise of the ultra right in Europe, with Donald Trump in the United States, and here in Pakistan, you have just bloodletting with Sunnis killing Shias and everybody after the Ahmadis and the Christians and the Hindus. And in India, that seems to be a country that's just gone mad with their protection of the cow. What's going on? There was a time of the European Enlightenment, and I know that you admire John Stuart Mill very much. Have we given up on the advances that humans had made in those times? What's going on?
Well, for one thing, remember my age. I was a child in the 1930s, and I, from a child's point of view, nevertheless could observe what's happening. This country was totally collapsing. A huge unemployment, starvation, and nothing working. In Europe, uh, Germany, Italy had fallen under fascist rule years before I was born. The US was, in fact, supporting Mussolini openly. Germany had fallen to Nazism by the early 30s. By 1938, Austria had fallen. Czechoslovakia was taken. Spain was being conquered by the fascist government of Franco. As you may know, the first article I wrote that I can remember, was in February 1939 when Barcelona fell. And the article was about the inexorable rise of fascism, which looks as if it's going to take over the world with everything collapsing here. Without going into detail, Japan was carrying out horrendous atrocities in East Asia. It was just horrifying, much worse than now. So it's not new. We've been through much worse periods, much worse. In fact, if the war had lasted another year, Germany might have actually won. It's no joke. You take a look at U.S., now that we know about U.S. planning, in the early years of the war, 39 to about 43, up till Stalingrad, after Stalingrad, U.S. planners were planning on a future world which would be partly U.S. dominated and partly German dominated. That is, large part of the world, most of Eurasia, would be under Nazism. Are we facing that? I mean, it's bad, but it's not that. So to say that there couldn't have been a harsher attack on the Enlightenment than Nazism, supported by leading figures like Martin Heidegger, who was writing in 1935 that Germany under the Nazis is the only hope of saving the magnificence of the Greek heritage from the barbarians of East and West. I mean, it's bad now, I agree, but not that. So first of all, I think we should keep a sense of proportion. Second, and there are other cases. During the First World War, it was just horrifying. Right after the First World War in the United States, Woodrow Wilson's administration launched a repression, which is the worst repression in U.S. history. Thousands of people were deported, huge numbers imprisoned. The labor movement was destroyed. Independent thought was destroyed. It was a deep, harsh repression. We've never had anything like it since. So you look over history, and look a little back further in the 19th century. What was the United States doing? It was running the worst, most hideous system of slavery in human history. It was exterminating the indigenous population step by step. carrying out well into the late 19th century attacks that by now are understood, even by scholarship, to be literally genocidal. Not a pretty history. The British were administering famines in India, which killed tens of millions of people while there was plenty of food around, but it was imperial policy. Went on till 1943, when Churchill decided that people in England needed white bread and so on. So a couple of million people in Bengal had to die. That was then. It's bad now, but not what's happened before. There's a lot of improvement. And what's happening now? So let's take now. Several things are happening. In the Western world, the United States and Europe, we've had, you take a look at the post-war period, post-Second World War. It's basically 2 eras. Now, there was a period of the 50s and the 60s, which had the highest growth of American history. No financial collapses, fairly egalitarian, first opportunities since Reconstruction for African Americans to somehow enter into the system, some progress in civil rights. A lot of things wrong, but substantial progress. That lasted into the 70s. 70s, you get a switch, significant switch in social and economic policy, and there are good reasons for it when you look at it. One of the main ones is that the rate of profit was declining as a result of militancy of labor and other activism. And there were clear statements about it. Powell Memorandum, Trilateral Commission report, others about the excess of democracy, and we have to return things to obedience and authority. That's all across the spectrum. You could go into it. Then come the shift to the neoliberal policies, which have had the anticipated effect. They have restored the rate of profit. There has been growth, not as in the past, but substantial. Wages and incomes for the majority have stagnated or declined. In 2007, we're at the period of euphoria about the amazing new great moderation, the wonders of neoclassical economics, every problem solved. 2007, right before the crash, the real wages of American workers were lower than they had been in 1979 when the neoliberal experiment began. The stagnation or decline for the population and the sharp concentration of wealth is part of a self-reinforcing cycle. The policies contribute to that. The concentration contributes to political power, which carries the policies further. There's been crash after crash with deregulation. We now have outside of the Republican Party, we have a recognition, at least, there's a serious problem with climate. Not nowhere near enough's been done about it. In Europe, in many ways, even worse, the austerity programs in Europe, run by the Troika, have significant. First of all, the whole European system, the way it's designed, is simply undermining democracy. Democratic decision making is being moved from the hands of people through their national states to an unelected bureaucracy. The European Commission, unelected, the IMF, and the central bank. That's it. It's the Troika. The people have almost no say in the policies of their governments that they're living with on important issues, and they know it. You're getting a sense of anger all through Europe and the United States about the centrist institutions, whether they're called center left or center right, but the main establishment institutions like the political parties that have been running the countries forever. Contempt, they're dissolving the French elections. They barely participated. The American elections, the striking fact about the American election was the election of a kind of an anti-establishment Republican. That's not so surprising. But the enormous success of the Sanders campaign, which broke with over a century of U.S. political history, no contribution, or mostly bought elections, no contributions from any of the major sources, media disregard or contempt. Most popular politician in the country probably would have won the Democratic Party nomination if it hadn't been for party managers. As the center's collapsing, the reason I think is traceable back to social, political developments that are taking place. There's more. The neoliberal form of globalization that was instituted in the 90s and since has magnified all these problems. It's called free trade, but it's not free trade. It has little to do with trade altogether. Highly protectionist investor rights systems, which are setting working people in competition with one another all over the world.
Well, thanks for putting things in perspective. And yes, I'm happy that you see that things are not as bleak as they are. But although what you say has a lot of explanatory power for what's happening in the United States or Brexit and so forth, but it doesn't tell me very much about why the Islamic world has exploded in this rage against the United States, rage against its own self. Why you have these Gaurakshaks in India who are just tearing apart Muslims, and then such peaceful people as the Buddhists. They've gone after the Rohingyas. I just don't understand what's going on.
Now, let's take Burma. It was a fairly democratic system through the 1950s, not great, but some kind of parliamentary system. The United States at the time was doing everything it could to attack China. And one of the things was setting up Chinese nationalist and tribal forces in the north of Burma to carry out attacks against China. And that fed back, of course, led to chaos and disruption. Finally, a military dictatorship took over. Okay, that was the end of Burmese parliamentary democracy. It was a horrible military dictatorship. Finally, in the last couple of years, it slightly relaxed somewhat, but not totally. But the Muslim attacks on the Rohingya are disgraceful, monstrous atrocities. The government, including Shuki, who ought to know better, are supporting it. India's it's a complicated story. There's not the history can be pretty ugly. I mean, the caste system in India is just a hideous disgrace. Last time I visited India and Pakistan, and you remember, and going from Calcutta to Lahore, the difference was shocking. I don't have to go through it. It wasn't pretty. There's a lot of wealth in India, tremendous wealth, a lot of enlightenment, and a lot of awful things. It's the most extreme mixture of wealth, high culture, enlightenment, and hideous poverty and disgraceful living standards that I've ever seen. Maybe you see something like it in a small Central Africa, but this is a huge country. So it's a very mixed story. Right now, there's a regression. In the Islamic world, it's been under attack for hundreds of years. There's been Syria right now is the most awful place. But take a look at Syria 100 years ago. 100 years ago, the Ottomans carried out a horrendous attack against Syrians. Syria probably lost more people during the war proportionally than any other country. 100,000 people were killed, probably. That's Syria. We can go through the rest. It hasn't been an attractive picture. There was a parliamentary government in Iran. What happened to it? Well, it made the mistake of trying to take control of its own resources. So the U.S. Carried out and instigated a coup which instituted the rule of the Shah, who annually was receiving the almost bitter condemnations from Amnesty International and others about his horrendous human rights record. Then came the overthrow of the government, 1979. What did the U.S. do? Immediately supported an Iraqi attack against Iran, gave it strong support, even to the extent of Reagan denying Saddam's responsibility for the awful atrocities against the Kurds, tried to blame it on Iran. The U.S. even permitted Saddam, they gave him a gift that's rarely allowed to anyone. He was allowed to attack an American ship, killing several dozen seamen, and to get away with a tap on the wrist. Real friend. Israel and the liberty is the only analog I can think of. Finally, the U.S. pretty much won the war for Iraq. Hundreds of thousands of Iranians were killed, chemical weapons used. We can go on in country after country. That's been the Middle East. It's not just the U.S., the French, the British, plenty of internal criminals, we can run through it. So now, right now, it's now the worst for the last couple of years, the worst monstrosity has been ISIS. Where'd that come from? Was there ISIS before the United States invaded Iraq? I mean, the invasion of Iraq, among other crimes, incited sectarian conflict, which barely existed before. It's now tearing not only that country, but the whole region apart. One of the outgrowths was ISIS. These things are not happening in a vacuum. You take a look at them, you can see the sources for all of them. They're anything like these things has multiple causes, but among the causes, and often quite significant among the causes, are the actions of the most enlightened states.
Well, thanks for that. I pretty much agree with all that you said, but the United States is a declining power. It's now no longer close to anything of what it was 50 years ago. Instead, we are seeing that China is coming up, and it's coming up very rapidly. You see its effects here in Pakistan very visibly. There's the Chinese-Pakistan economic corridor. They're beginning to dominate industry over here. They're building roads, and you see Chinese people all over the place now. So I want to ask you, Noam, if we have a world that's dominated by China than the United States, is this going to be a better world, a more humane world, one that runs according to rules, one that will be less imperialistic? Should we expect a more humane outcome now that the U.S. is in decline?
Well, first of all, I don't think it's a remote possibility. I mean, it's true that the United States is a declining power. It's been a declining power since 1949. The peak of U.S. power was in 1945. At that point, the U.S. had maybe almost half the world's wealth, incredible security, controlled the hemisphere, both oceans, opposite sides of both oceans. Other industrial societies had been either devastated or severely weakened. The U.S. economy had boomed during the Second World War. The end of the Depression, industrial production almost quadrupled. They're just sitting on top of the world, in fact, planning to run the world. Well, something happened in 1949, the first blow to this hegemony. The event was called in the United States the loss of China. It took many years before people started noticing there's something a little odd about that phrase. And by now, people would qualify it. But for decades, it was the loss of China. The presupposition being we own the world and we lost China. So that's a terrible thing. It was a major fact in U.S. Domestic policy. The basis for McCarthyism, the harsh repression. When John F. Kennedy was wondering whether to escalate in Vietnam, he was afraid that he'd be accused of the loss of Indochina. This huge attack on American power. And from then on, it declined. By the early 70s, the world was economically pretty much tripolar, with a North American, US-based center, a European, German-based center, and a Northeast Asian, at that point Japan-based center. Not comparable in power, but economically independent, fairly comparable actors. In fact, you may recall in the 1980s, Japan is number one. The fear is Japan's going to take over the world. Well, the United States has somewhat declined since, but at that point, maybe U.S. share of world wealth was maybe 25% lower than it had been after the Second World War. That's declined somewhat since. Up till things are changing with Trump. Trump may, in fact, contribute to a rapid decline in U.S. power. That's a special phenomenon. He's isolating the United States, even from its close allies. But putting that aside, the long-term tendency, which I suspect is not going to change much, is the U.S. will continue to be militarily just beyond any comparison. Don't even have to talk about it. Economically, a very powerful state, but that's misleading, because in the contemporary globalized system, the system that's developed pretty much since the 90s, with complicated value chains, a corporation, if an Apple computer, the profit is mostly in the United States, but it's put together, assembled in China, mostly under the control of a Taiwanese company. The parts and components come from South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, small enterprises all over the place are making little pieces of it. The offices are in Ireland, so they don't have to pay taxes. That's the biggest company in the world. You take a look at the globalized economy that's developed. Turns out that U.S. corporations own about half the world economy. That's probably even more than U.S. power in 1950. I mean, that's not a measure that's usually used, but it's becoming a significant measure. National accounts still mean a lot, but not what they did 50 years ago. Now, and of course, these corporations are based in the United States, supported in the United States, both with subsidies and militarily and diplomatically and so on. But they pretty much own the world. China's not anywhere near. You take a look at in sector after sector, manufacturing, retail, commerce, whatever you look at, U.S. corporations are one, occasionally two. China's nowhere to be seen. China is a growing, developing power, but it's a poor country. Take a look at rankings in the UN Development Index. I think it ranks around 90th or something. Has enormous internal problems that the West doesn't have. Enormous ecological problems. Has demographic problems. There was a bump of demographic bump for about 20 years of people of working age, of people of work, males mostly, but females too, of working age. It's declining. It's moving significantly in many directions, but has enormous problems. What China is doing, and Pakistan is part of this, is expanding its system of social and economic control to the West. That's been going on for some years with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and now the New Silk Road projects goes into Pakistan, building a new port, Gwadar port, to try to avoid the stranglehold that the U.S. and its allies have on the Malacca Straits, for oil going to the West. And this is going to expand. India is now part. Pakistan, Iran will sooner or later probably reach Turkey, into Europe, and Eastern Russia, Siberia is part of it. And that's build the Asian Development Bank, Shanghai, is going to become more and more important. Almost every country outside the United States, including U.S. allies, is participating. The U.S. withdraws from world affairs very sharply under Trump, but it's been going slowly. Chinese influence will, of course, increase. Is it benign? Far from it. Chinese developments in Africa are, they do build things which the Africans can use, but the British did that in India too. It's the overall effect is pretty ugly, and you can expect it to be the same. But I don't think it's anywhere near a power on anywhere near the scale of the United States or likely.
Well, once upon a time, the United States had the power to make and break governments here in Pakistan, and the US was all over the place. They gave arms they gave fighter jets, destroyers, whatever, to the army, navy, and so forth. And they had enormous power. But that's no longer true. Now it's a fading presence over here. Instead, you see that it's the Chinese fighter jets, which the Pakistan Air Force has, and China is everywhere, and it's sweeter. Our friendship is sweeter than honey and higher than the Himalayas and all that sort of stuff. Should thinking Pakistanis be worried about what's going on in terms of our relationship with China?
Yeah, should be worried about any great power. China's one. And in Pakistan, what you describe is quite true. But in the world, that's still a very partial and small part. I mean, China's presence you see everywhere. They go to South America, say Brazil, Chinese goods all over the place. The trading relations, and this is part of the serious problem of South American failure to develop, has been reliance on their rich resources of primary products in recent years being sucked up by China. In return, China sends cheap manufacturing goods which undermine domestic manufacturing and industry. So, yeah, that's a real problem. But it's not on the order of overthrowing governments, instituting military regimes, invading massive economic controls. I mean, it's nowhere near the power of the Western imperial powers. The U.S. obviously, but Britain and France as well.
No, here in Pakistan, nobody seems to be worrying about nuclear weapons very much, but we've entered an extraordinarily dangerous phase where we have exchanges of artillery fire across the line of control practically every day. And then on the other hand, Pakistan has gone in for tactical nuclear weapons, which are relatively easy to use and very hard to control. And similarly, India is going in for nuclear submarines and nuclear launch ballistic missiles and so forth. Now, things seem to be getting very dangerous here, but it's even more dangerous in North Korea, where there's such a tense nuclear standoff at the moment with the North Korean regime developing missiles and even a hydrogen bomb. How do you see this panning out? Are things in our control anymore?
Well, we have to take each case on its own. Take India and Pakistan. As you say, India developed nuclear weapons. Pakistan then responded. I mean, as long as Pakistan tries to match India militarily, Pakistan they just can't compete with India. They can't match India. The only way they can nuclear weapons program, which is a devastating threat not only to South Asia but to the world. So how did Pakistan at first? Are you still hearing me? Because it says your internet.
Yes.
You can. Well, at first the United States opposed Indian nuclear weapons development. And at least formally, it did so up until the George Bush administration, which decided to support it. Various trickery, which we don't have to go through, but it ended up effectively giving U.S. support for Indian nuclear weapons, and indeed twisting the arms of the International Nuclear Control Group to get them to kind of authorize it. And what about Pakistan? In the 1980s, under Zia-ul-Haq, Pakistan began to develop nuclear weapons. The Reagan administration pretended that they didn't know. It's inconceivable that they didn't know, with all their intelligence assets in Pakistan. Defies belief. But they pretended they didn't know, because they wanted to keep funding Pakistan to carry out their policies in Afghanistan, which had nothing to do with helping the Afghans. The CIA chief in Islamabad, as you may recall, made that very explicit. He said, "We're not there to help the Afghans. We want to harm the Russians. We want to make the Russians bleed." So for that, they destroyed Afghanistan and watched silently while Pakistan developed nuclear weapons. Now, the basic conflict, correct me if you think this is wrong, but it seems to me the basic India-Pakistan conflict is probably over Kashmir. And until that's settled in some fashion, and I think you can imagine settlements, actually Iqbal Ahmed had sensible proposals for settlement. I think they could be pursued. If they could be pursued, then maybe India and Pakistan could relax the military confrontation and maybe move towards what ought to happen all through the world, and has partially happened already, setting up of nuclear weapons-free zones. You could imagine moving to a South Asian nuclear weapons-free zone, as has happened in the Western Hemisphere, apart from the US and Canada. The Pacific, in Africa, almost. Africa has a nuclear weapons-free zone, but it's never gone into effect because of Diego Garcia. The US insists on maintaining a huge nuclear presence on the island of Diego Garcia, which the Africans regard as part of Africa. Now, Pacific has a nuclear weapons-free zone, almost. At first, France blocked it because they wanted to carry out the tests in their islands there. More recently, the U.S. has blocked it because it wants to store nuclear weapons and have nuclear weapons passage through its possessions there. But it almost works. The most interesting is the Middle East. Now, right now, we're facing a major, I'll come back to North Korea, we're facing a major potential crisis in the case of Iran. The Trump administration, as you know, has announced they're going to decertify Iran. Then comes the question whether Congress will impose sanctions. If they do, that kills the U.S.-Iranian deal, might go on with Europe, but the U.S.-Iranian part will drop. Iran may react, and if they do, what happens next? Well, you can listen to the Republican senators, the leading ones. On the right, Tom Cotton says, as soon as we find they're doing anything, we'll bomb them. Towards the other end, what's called, I don't know what you call it, the adult end of the Republican Party. It's a crazed party. But the sort of sane end, you have what's his, Bob Corker, just retired because he can't handle the craziness. What he said is our strategy is to try to drive Iran into some kind of violation. And if they carry out a violation, then boom, that's the sane side. That's what we're facing in Iran. What's the problem with Iranian weapons? Well, U.S. intelligence has made it very explicit. They say the problem is it'll be part of their deterrent strategy. And the rogue states, the United States and Israel, can't tolerate a deterrent. I mean, he didn't say that, of course, I'm adding it, but that's what it comes down to. So it'll be part of nobody sane thinks they're going to ever use nuclear weapons. It could be a deterrent. And the states that like to rampage freely in the region don't want to have deterrents around. So if, in fact, Iran acts in a way which the administration and Congress can claim as a violation, maybe Israel bombed, then the U.S. will get in and bomb too. Then what happens? Half the world blows up. You don't know what will happen. Is there a possible answer? Yeah, straightforward. The Europeans know the answer. In fact, everybody in the world knows the answer. Just continue with the agreement. The agreement, in my view, was too harsh on Iran. It's another story. But they've accepted it and they're living up to it, so pursue it. Is there a further possibility? Yeah. The further possibility is to accept Iran's proposal to advocacy of establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. That would be very important. Iran's in favor of it. The non-aligned countries have been pushing it for years. The United States and Britain are committed to it. Committed to it. Nobody will say it. But when they decided to attack Iran in 2003, as a pretext, they invoked a treaty, an agreement with Iran back after the Kuwait War. And if you read that agreement, take a look at Article 14, it says the U.S. and Britain will be committed to establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. Nobody can refer to that, obviously, but you can find it. So everybody in the world, at least in theory, is in favor of it. It never happens because the U.S. blocks it at every nuclear review session, every one of the periodic nuclear review sessions, last one in 2015. But is that a possible? And of course, everybody knows why, exactly why. It would mean that Israel's nuclear weapons would have to come under international inspection. And the U.S. won't accept that. Israel, of course, won't. So is there a long-term solution there? Yeah, possibly. We've covered most of the world except for North Korea. Is there a possible solution there? Yeah. And in fact, everybody knows what it is, except the Chinese proposal with Russian support and North Korean acquiescence for what's called a double freeze. North Korea freezes its nuclear weapons programs. The United States calls off threatening military maneuvers on North Korea's borders, like nuclear-capable bombers flying right at the border, and that sort of thing. And the North Koreans have some memories. Don't have to go into it, but North Korea was absolutely wiped out in a savage assault, mostly after the war had settled down at the 38th parallel, just pure savagery, brutality, real crimes, and they remember it, like bombing dams and so on and so forth. So that's a first step in a solution. What comes next? Negotiations, diplomacy. Could they succeed? Yeah, they could. In fact, if you look at the record, no time to go through it, but every time when there have been repeated times when an agreement was reached, in fact, in 2005, even an agreement in which North Korea agreed to dismantle its program in return for some concessions by the West, like the United States, that means, like an ending of the threat of aggression, providing a low uranium enrichment plant for research and medical purposes, not interfering with financial actions and so on. The Bush administration immediately backed off it. So North Korea started building weapons again. And in fact, it's a horrible place, no doubt, but it's been playing a kind of tit-for-tat diplomacy. That could continue. So there are possible answers there, too. The sunshine policy of South Korea for a time was a move towards relaxing tensions, commercial, cultural, other interactions might break into the North Korean system, which is hideous, no doubt, but the regime is committed to survive, to its own survival, not surprisingly, and there is also committed to economic development. There has been some economic development in the past years that can be exploited as a move towards more peaceful relations, maybe denuclearization of that region. So I think everywhere you look, in fact, what about the major nuclear powers? Well, as I don't have to tell you, they are committed on the Non-Proliferation Treaty to good faith efforts to eliminate them. with enough pressure, I think maybe that could happen. So I think it's a horrible threat and danger, but it's not out of human control. It's all under human control, every point.
It's quite incredible, Noam, that you wrote your first article in 1939. You've had a lifetime of activism. You've been fighting against all the wrong things that the United States has done. But do you see the world as being better today as compared to, let's say, the end of the Second World War, which we can leave out as a period of major atrocities? But subsequent to that, do you see any kind of hope or improvement as time has gone on? You know, there's Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, and of course you must be familiar with it. He says that over the last 5,000 years or so, or since recorded human history, we've been steadily improving. Is that the case? If we look around, it doesn't seem to be so. What do you say about that?
Well, let's put that book aside. I think it has many deep problems, but part of it is correct. Since one major part is that since 1945, the European countries have recognized that they cannot play their favorite game anymore. For centuries, Europe was the most savage place in the world. Horrible. I mean, the 30 Years' War in the 17th century probably killed a third of the population of Germany. The European savagery then expanded over much of the world with consequences I don't have to describe. But it was recognized, and the last paroxysm was, of course, the Second World War. And it was recognized by 1945 they can't play that game anymore. If there's a major war among European powers, we're all dead. Okay, that's finished. So Europe has been at peace, which is not a small thing if you look at the past centuries. That's a huge thing. Another element that's true is I don't think it has anything to do with the better angels of our nature. I think it has to do with the worst devils of our nature, which created means of destruction which will wipe us all out. And recognition of that is, I think, a major factor in this very significant change. I should say the scholarly literature has a different explanation. They say it's democracy and so on. Skeptical about that. Another true thing is that since the Enlightenment, there has been among a sector of the population a period of advance of rationality, moral commitment, recognition of human rights, and so on. But we should remember that the period of the Enlightenment and afterwards was the worst period of Western imperialism, with horrible consequences all over the world. I mean, the Western Hemisphere, population of maybe 80 million people went down to hundreds of thousands. But in the northern part, maybe 18 million down to maybe 1 million or something. A huge slaughter, not for all kind of reasons. That was the period of enlightenment. But for part of the world, it is quite true that there was significant moral, intellectual progress, and it's extended. In the last, I think, take the United States, country I know best, obviously. It's a much more civilized country than it was 50 years ago, in many respects. The women's rights, for example, enormous change. Civil rights are pretty awful, but there's some improvement. Opposition to aggression has increased substantially. When the U.S. invaded Vietnam, there was no protest. Who cares? Worst crime since the Second World War. It took years before any protest developed. And that's changed. There's also the beginnings, much too late, but the beginnings of serious concern about environmental catastrophe, which is going to do us in unless significant steps are taken. And finally, there's growing recognition of that. No means enough, but some. I mean, all of this is progress. It's not total progress. There's also regression. Things go in all directions. But I think the general tendency in the long run is towards somewhat more humane and civilized societies.
Well, thanks for that. It's been a long interview, and I'm going to let you go, but there's a last question. You've had a very long life of activism and academics, and you've seen things go downhill, but you've never given up. What is it that keeps you going? What is it that keeps you giving hope and keeps giving you that energy to just go for it?
Well, for one thing, there are a lot of good things, as I've mentioned, and there are a lot of bad things, which means there's more work to do. So, very simple.
Oh, you're a terrific guy now. It was such a pleasure talking to you. Take care. Bye.
Good to talk to you.